Let's try a review question. The authorized holder of a document or material is responsible for determining at the time of creation whether the information falls into a CUI category. If so, the authorized holder is responsible for applying CUI markings and dissemination instructions accordingly. Each organization within DoD may generate specific guidance. According to CUI Notice 2020-03, Non-Disclosure Agreement Template for CUI, an NDA is optional. However, the executive agent, or EA, strongly recommends using the CUI NDA to increase standardization across the executive branch and in contracts. The Secretary has directed the DoD to issue a DoD CUI NDA. Access the Resources tab to review the CUI NDA. Every individual at every level, including DoD civilian and military personnel, as well as contractors providing support to the DoD in accordance with the contractual requirements, will comply with the requirements in DoDI 5200.48. More information on marking, safeguarding, dissemination, and destruction will be provided as you go through the training. We've mentioned the responsibilities of the individual with regard to CUI. But what about other responsibilities within the DoD? DoDI 5200.48 identifies departmental officials and elements with oversight responsibilities within DoD. For more information on the responsibilities, access the Resources tab to review the regulatory guidance. So how do you identify what is CUI? The ISUE CUI registry is the government-wide online repository for federal-level guidance regarding CUI policy and practice. The ISUE CUI registry is available to all military, civilian, and contractor employees. Look at the example on the screen. Note the categories, markings, and control sections. You will see a category list, CUI markings, limited dissemination controls, decontrol, and a registry change log. There is also a section for policy and guidance and a glossary. Select the Resources tab to see a listing of regulatory guidance and links to the ISUE registry. The DoD CUI registry is built on the ISUE registry with the addition of the DoD issuance alignment. There is also a breakout of other types of information which could meet the threshold of CUI, particularly under the OPSEC category. A Common Access Card, or CAC, is required to access the DoD registry, and an Intel Link account must be created. The Government Contracting Activities, or GCA, will be required to provide CUI registry information to contractors. Automatic notifications will not be generated as the DoD CUI registry changes, so periodically check for updates. Select the Resources tab for links to Intel Link and the DoD CUI registry. There are two designations for CUI, Basic and Specified, or SP. CUI Basic is the subset of CUI for which the authorizing law, regulation, or government-wide policy does not set out specific handling or dissemination controls. Agencies handle CUI Basic according to the uniform set of controls set forth in DoDI 5200.48 and the DoD CUI registry. CUI Specified is the subset of CUI in which the authorizing law, regulation, or government-wide policy contains specific handling controls that it requires or permits agencies to use that differ from those for CUI Basic. The distinction is the underlying authority spells out the controls for CUI Specified information and does not for CUI Basic information. During DoD's initial implementation of the CUI program, DoD personnel are not to use any abbreviation that includes SP. Before you mark a document as CUI, you must first determine if the information is CUI. The first page of the CUI Marking Job Aid, available in the Resources, provides a flowchart to assist you in the identification process. At initial CUI implementation, the only authorized marking for DoD CUI documents is the acronym CUI in the banner and footer of the document, as shown on the screen. Do not add the U signifying unclassified to the banner and footer as was required with the previous FOUO marking. For example, U//FOUO. There is a requirement to add the CUI designation indicator to the first page or cover of any document containing CUI. This indicator will be located in the lower right corner and must contain at a minimum the name of the DoD component determining that the information is CUI. If letterhead is used, this line may be omitted. Note in the example on the screen that this document was on letterhead, so that line was omitted. The second line must identify the office making the determination. During DoD's initial implementation, this will be the originator of the document. The third line must identify all types of CUI contained in the document. The fourth line must contain the distribution statement or limited dissemination controls. If a distribution statement is required, such as for CTI, the words distribution statement and the letter is required. For example, distribution statement B. And the fifth line must contain the phone number or office mailbox for the originating DoD component or authorized CUI holder. Take a look at the screen. Here is an example of portion marking. Portion markings are not required. If portion markings are selected, then all document subjects and titles, as well as individual sections, parts, paragraphs, or similar portions of a CUI document known to contain CUI, will be portion marked with CUI in accordance with DODI 5200.48 and additional component guidance. Use of the unclassified marking U as a portion marking for unclassified information within CUI documents or materials is required. Banners, footers, and portion marking will only be marked unclassified, or U, for unclassified information in accordance with the June 4, 2019 ISU letter. Select the Resources tab to review the letter. In this next example, we have a CUI-only document with limited dissemination controls, or LDC. LDCs are utilized within DoD to limit access to certain agency-specific CUI within an organization. Take a look at the third line in the designation indicator. Note that this document has a Fed-only dissemination control. This LDC will apply to all CUI within a document. For each individual portion, prior to secondary dissemination, authorized holders must contact the originator of the information to determine the applicability of the LDC to that specific portion. As a quick review, take a look at the two documents on the screen. The document to the left is marked correctly, while the document over to the right is not. Access the Resources tab to review the CUI Marking Job Aid for additional examples on marking CUI. The use of a CUI cover page, as shown on the screen, is optional but encouraged and can be found by selecting the Resources tab. The label SF902 is used to identify and protect electronic and other media that contains CUI. Let's try a review question. The CUI markings in a commingled classified document will appear in paragraphs or subparagraphs known to contain only CUI and must be portion marked with CUI. CUI will not appear in the banner or footer. An acknowledgement must be added to the warning box on the first page of multi-page documents to alert readers to the presence of CUI in a classified DoD document. As mentioned in the previous examples, there is a requirement to add the CUI designation indicator to the first page of the document in the lower right corner. For more information on markings for classified documents, please reference DODM 5200.01, Volume 2, available in the Resources tab. Let's look at some examples of markings for an email. In the first example, note that the minimum marking required is CUI in the banner line and footer. The email must also contain the CUI designation indicator. In the second example, you see that portion markings have been included. The banner line and footer and CUI designation indicator are also required. For additional information and examples, a CUI marking job aid is available in the resources. Let's try a review question. So how and when is CUI decontrolled? Decontrolling and releasing CUI records is executed by the originator of the information, the Original Classification Authority, or OCA, if identified in a Security Classification Guide, or SCG, or designated offices for decontrolling. There are no specific timelines to decontrol CUI unless specifically required in a law, regulation, or government-wide policy. Decontrol will occur when the CUI no longer requires safeguarding and will follow DoD records management procedures. Select the Resources tab for guidance on these procedures. Agencies must promptly decontrol CUI properly determined by the CUI owner to no longer require safeguarding or dissemination controls unless doing so conflicts with the related law, regulation, or government-wide policy. Decontrolling CUI through the public release process relieves authorized holders from requirements for handling information in accordance with the CUI program. A pre-publication review must be conducted in accordance with the DODI 5230.09 and DODI 5230.29 before public release may be authorized. As a reminder, pre-publication review of unclassified information is required prior to public release regardless of whether or not it was ever subject to control. When CUI is decontrolled, all known holders will be notified by email or other means. Upon notification, holders will remove the CUI markings. Holders will not need to retrieve records on file solely for this purpose. Information with a decontrolled CUI status will not be publicly released without review. Review the CUI marking job aid for an example of a decontrolled document. Let's try a review question. We have discussed recognizing, marking, and decontrolling CUI. But how do you safeguard it? All DoD information will be protected in accordance with the requirements under the basic level of safeguard and dissemination unless specifically identified otherwise in a law, regulation, or government-wide policy. During working hours, take steps to minimize the risk of access by unauthorized personnel, such as not reading, discussing, or leaving CUI unattended where unauthorized personnel are present. The use of CUI cover sheets, as mentioned earlier, is optional. After working hours, CUI will be stored in unlocked containers, desks, or cabinets. If the government or government contract building provides security for continuous monitoring of access. If building security is not provided, the information will be stored in locked desks, file cabinets, bookcases, locked rooms, or similarly secured areas. The concept of a controlled environment means there is sufficient internal security measures in place to prevent or detect unauthorized access to CUI. For DoD, an open storage environment meets these requirements. For information systems, the basic system and network configuration is moderate confidentiality, in accordance with the guidelines of National Institute of Standards and Technology, or the NIST, SP 800-171 for non-federal systems, and the NIST SP 800-53 for federal systems. CUI material may be transmitted via first-class mail, partial post, or bulk shipments. When practical, CUI may be transmitted electronically. For example, data, website, or email via approved secure communication systems or systems utilizing other protective measures such as public key infrastructure, PKI, or transport layer security. Example, HTTPS. Avoid wireless telephone transmission of CUI when other options are available. CUI transmission via facsimile machine is permitted. However, the sender is responsible for determining whether appropriate protection will be available at the receiving location before transmission. For example, facsimile machine attended by a person authorized to receive the CUI. A facsimile machine located in a controlled government environment. You have learned how to mark, safeguard, and decontrol CUI, but now it needs to be destroyed. What do you do? Before any CUI can be destroyed, it must be processed through the records management procedures. It must be identified as temporary or permanent and handled accordingly. When destroying CUI, including in electronic form, agencies must do so in a manner making it unreadable, indecipherable, and irrecoverable. If the law, regulation, or government-wide policy specifies a method of destruction, agencies must use the method prescribed. Two approved methods for destroying paper-based CUI are cross-cut shredding that produces 1 mm by 5 mm particles or smaller, or pulverizing. Additional guidance for destroying CUI documents and materials is provided in DODM 5200.01 Volume 3 and CUI Notice 2019-03. CUI documents and materials will be formally reviewed in accordance with DODI 5230.09 and DODI 5200.48 before approved disposition authorities are applied, including destruction. Select the Resources tab for access to the regulatory guidance. Who can access CUI? Access to CUI is based on having a lawful government purpose, unlike the Need to Know, or NTK, required for access to classified information. CUI access should be encouraged and permitted to the extent the access or dissemination complies with the law, regulation, or government-wide policy identifying the information as CUI, furthers a lawful government purpose, is not restricted by an authorized distribution statement, or limited dissemination control, or LDC, is not otherwise prohibited by any other law, regulation, or government-wide policy. Agencies may place limits on disseminating CUI for a lawful government purpose only using the dissemination controls identified in DODI 5200.48 or methods authorized by a specific law, regulation, or government-wide policy. LDCs, or distribution statements, cannot unnecessarily restrict CUI access. Since DoD components need to retain certain agency-specific CUI within their organizations, DoD components may use the LDCs to limit access to those on an accompanying dissemination list. For example, raw data information or products must be processed and analyzed before determining if further dissemination is required or permitted. Access the CUI Marking Job Aid from the Resources tab for information on LDCs. Let's try a review question. What happens if CUI is misused, disclosed without authorization, or improperly marked? The DoD Component's Senior Agency Official, or CSAO, and Component Program Manager, or CPM, will establish procedures to ensure prompt and appropriate management action to take in cases of CUI misuse, including unauthorized disclosure, UD, of CUI, and improper CUI designation and marking, violation of DoD I5200.48, and incidents potentially placing CUI at risk of UD. Such actions will focus on correcting or eliminating the conditions contributing to the incident. For UD of CUI, no formal security inquiry or investigation is required unless disciplinary action will be taken against the individual or individuals responsible. In such cases, a preliminary inquiry is appropriate. UD of certain CUI, such as export-controlled technical data, may also result in potential civil and criminal sanctions against responsible persons based on the procedures codified in the relevant law, regulation, or government-wide policy. The DoD component originating the CUI is informed of any UD. Administrative, civil, or criminal sanctions may be imposed based on the category of CUI. Reporting or accounting for UD of CUI shall be done in accordance with DoD I5200.48. Report misuse, mishandling, or UD of CUI to the UD Program Management Office, or PMO. In addition, notify the appropriate military department counterintelligence, or CI, organization of all incidents. When will I be required to implement CUI requirements? Refer to your Component Program Manager for implementation guidance and other questions regarding CUI. Be required to implement CUI requirements. Refer to your Component Program Manager for implementation guidance and other questions regarding CUI. Now that you have completed this training, you should be able to explain the purpose for the CUI program, describe the purpose and location of the ISUE and DoD CUI registries, apply proper initial marking requirements, identify decontrol requirements, describe safeguarding requirements, identify proper destruction methods, apply appropriate access and dissemination controls, explain the procedures for identifying and reporting security incidents, and state the implementation guidelines for CUI. In order to receive a certificate of training, you must complete the assessment and score a 70% or greater. Select the Take Assessment button when you're ready to begin.